What I'm going to do is present a quick scenario that I want to test you with in terms of NATO, and then I'm going to open it to the floor. If you put together everything that we've discussed here this morning thus far, what is the worst case? And Ben's vision, black vision of a war with China, what would be the implications for NATO? Imagine this, a major war in Asia Pacific, the US forced to deploy a large amount of its forces therein. There's the idea that somehow there would be a single scenario in Asia Pacific and not a scenario in the Middle East and indeed in and around Europe with an opportunistic Russia, I find fanciful. It's likely that America's life would be complicated even further by having to face simultaneous scenarios. What in that event, with a war in Asia Pacific in the next decade, with the Middle East in crisis, and with an opportunistic Russia in and around NATO, with Europeans forced to be the first responders in such an event, would Europe be up to that challenge, given the changing correlation of forces therein? I'll start with you, Hervé, if I can. What do you think?
All right. Well, thank you. Well, I think there is one piece we have not mentioned so far that would be, for me, a worst-case scenario is that we would be so focused in conventional fighting that we will forget and will let the field for development of terrorism back. And I remember that in the new NATO military strategy, we are addressing two threats. It could be discussed, but that's the way it has been noted by nations. It's Russia and it's terrorism. And I would say, I'm pretty sure that we would be able to deal with Russia within the European continent with the proper reinforcement, maybe not in matter of troops, but in matter of equipment from North America. But doing so will be so focused on that will have to be lighter on the south flank. Yeah. And that's, I think, where the danger would be.
Ben?
So the United States Navy between 1911 and 1941 did 130 separate war games specifically oriented on a coming conflict with Japan. Even before the First World War, the Navy was already recognizing that this was a possibility. And of course, they included the possibility of a war with Great Britain as well, but fortunately that never materialized.
You've lost.
We could continue that part. But Admiral Nimitz said after the war, he said that the war in the Pacific was won on the floor of the wargaming room at the Naval War College. And that he said that they foresaw everything that unfolded in the Pacific except for the kamikaze attacks. They had not anticipated that. Now, they also foresaw the attack on Pearl Harbor. But, you still had a Navy that was controlled by battleships, by battleship admirals. But fortunately, these war games had done enough to change the thinking so that fortunately you still had a handful of aircraft carriers and the Navy aviation was at a certain point of development that it was able to become the decisive part of the Navy's ability in the Pacific. So the point is, my biggest concern is that there is such a lack of willingness to address the possibility of an actual kinetic conflict. I hear this every time I use this 10-year thing. Why would they do that? Nobody has anything to gain from that. But it's about miscalculation, and it's also we cannot project Western thinking and logic on the Kremlin or on the Chinese Communist Party.
Admiral?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. It's a difficult question to answer as well. If you look at the military strength of nations like China, Russia, NATO, the United States, I think that any kind of warfare based on conventional principles would be something that the United States and NATO nations would win. at least in the near future. The question is, what will the losing party do when they are convinced they are losing?
Yeah.
They are both nuclear powers. They are both powers with tremendous capabilities in cyber warfare. They can destroy our society in different ways than through conventional warfare. And that is the scaring part. When do you get to that point, that tipping point, when you start using these kind of weapons? And history tells us, if you look at World War I and World War II, if anything like that starts, the strategic landscape totally changes through the war and afterwards. And that is the challenge, I think, whether it comes from the east, from the north, or whether it starts off in the soft belly in the Mediterranean. Not Mediterranean, Middle East.
I mean, let me follow that up with Andrew and Camilla and get your response to this. Are we not in danger as well of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of planning for the worst case promotes the worst case? Does China really have implications for the way NATO's deterrence and defence be organised? Camilla?
Well, well, I think you're right that there is, of course, a risk of the self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's why I liked the dime concept that you brought in, right? Because there has to be a division of labor, and of course, the military, as always, they have to prepare for the worst case. But then diplomacy has to come in, and all the other things that can try to prevent the worst case from happening, right? And I think there are still a lot of things to do. And I'm very concerned, as I hope my slides also indicated. I'm very concerned both about specifically in the Arctic, but also generally in the way that this U.S.-China strategic rivalry kind of come and set the overall frame of a lot of what's happening in international politics and international economy.
Do you think Europeans have a role to mitigate?
I hope, at least, and I think I'm somewhat encouraged by the recent EU-China strategy that we also discussed yesterday, that is somewhat more in many ways, in Europe, we've had the privilege of only approaching China as an economic market. In Denmark, we still only have a growth market strategy for China, right? But now we are, especially with the Arctic for the Nordic countries, we're getting to confront China as a great power with all that, what that entails, right? And I see that development already happening in Brussels. So whether how it will be implemented, whether it's possible to get agreement among the European states, etc., we'll still have to see.
Yeah.
But at least there is some new thinking and some encouraging thinking in the way that they try to position themselves, if not as a mediator, then at least seeing a role in trying to find the balance between confronting and cooperating with China.
Andrew, I'm listening to this conversation and I'm hearing phrases like great power politics. But I also understand that Europeans are very much focused on international community, a different set of organising international relations. Do you think they're compatible, those two approaches, or do you think great power politics that's re-emerged will in the end submerge European ideas of international community and will go back to balances of power and spheres of influence?
Gosh, that's an easy question.
Answer in 1 minute.
Honestly, it's hard to say, but the grand European experiment, I think, is impressive, despite those pesky Brits.
Yeah.
And it seems like Europe continues to hold together both economically and militarily and diplomatically, and I think that's a source of wonder and amazement to other power centers, whether it's the U.S. or Russia or China. And so it sounds really trite, but if Europe continues to be the best, strive to be the best it can be, I think that is an important, not insignificant outcome. Just want to make two other quick points.
Please.
When we talk about what does this war look like that we hopefully will never see, I think it is important to tease that out and think about what outcomes would be acceptable. What is our theory of victory, or maybe as importantly, what is the theory of an acceptable outcome to Russia or China, short of escalating all the way to Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon. And so I think those are important things to be thinking about. And then, if we're thinking worst case, I think there is a difference between having. I think it's right to think about two different, two contingencies. One in Europe and one in Asia. But it could be, or two separate wars. But the worst case scenario, I would suggest, is a two-front war. And that would mean Russia and China fighting as allies. I think that's highly unlikely, but that really is the worst case scenario.
I think it is too, and we'll unpack that later. Now, what I'm going to do, we've got 35 minutes left. I want to open it to the floor. I'll take questions in threes, and I want no counter speeches, please, otherwise I'll cut you off. Who's first? Sir. There's a microphone heading in your direction imminently.
Hello.
Who are you?
Yes, hello. I'm Magnus Trøan. I'm with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My question is for Mr. Sobel. Regarding the projection ladder that you outlined, and also raising the South China Sea issue, which was on the map and mentioned by several of the panelists, I was just wondering where you would put the South China Sea issue on that ladder, because I think from the outside perspective, at least from Europe, you would see that as a projection into China's periphery, into the waters of its neighboring countries. However, from a Chinese strategist's perspective, I think they would rather consider that their homeland. Of course, why that is important is that I think there's a qualitative difference between securing your homeland and projecting into the periphery. And so how worried should we be about China expanding its presence into the South China Sea? And I think we maybe be able to include Taiwan here as well. I don't know your views on that.
Thank you. Sir. And then here.
Good morning. I'm Geir Hågen Karlsen from the Norwegian Defense University College. I got a question about Chinese ambitions when it comes to nuclear submarines. A number of researchers have pointed out that they will have an ambition in the future to deploy those under the polar ice. That would take a lot of investment, a lot of research and so on, but if anyone can expand on the possible implications for Norway, Denmark and other polar states on Chinese activity in the future, I would be happy. Thanks.
Thank you. Madam.
Thank you. My name is Betsy Kawamura, and I do consultancy work on women, peace, and security issues for Northeast Asia, including North Korea. I realize you might not have all the time to comment on this, but what do you think is the role of the ROK in Japan in terms of the scenario that you present? Some likely scenarios and alliances. Thank you.
Right, they're my first three questions. Andrew, would you take the first question that was directed at you?
Okay. South China Sea. I think the tendency is to underestimate the potential for escalation in the South China Sea, because this is both sides both the U.S. and China seem supposedly recognize that escalation is not a wise thing to do, and it's not as tense as the Taiwan Strait could become again, and yet precisely because I think both sides underestimate the escalation for potential for escalation, it could actually be more. It could happen, and neither side want a war. China, because they don't think they can win right now. And that's precisely why they're pursuing this, what I call slow intensity conflict, or SLIC, or what most other people talk about, gray zone phenomenon, that to expand their interests, strengthen their presence in the South China Sea, but keep below the threshold of, well below the threshold of war. So the maritime militia, the Coast Guard, and the PLA coordinating to strengthen China's hold on the South China Sea. So we shouldn't take our eye off the South China Sea. And of course, also it's a stepping stone. How well China does inside the first island chain determines or influences significantly what it'll do outside the first island chain.
Hervé.
Yeah, just something to add. We know, and know we are back in NATO's area of responsibility, that China has done a lot of benchmarking about what happened in the Black Sea, annexation of Crimea. So benchmarking the courses of action, how do you retake a land that you think belongs to you? And also what's going on with the Kerch Strait issue, because that's also a policy of the fait accompli in some areas, and they are very strong at that. So there are some connections there. They have not entered the Black Sea yet, but I think that will be a next move.
Anyone else wish to comment on that question? In which case, I'll move on to the issue of the potential deployment of Chinese nuclear hunter-killers in the Arctic region, and I'll ask my two naval colleagues first to respond to that, and then Camilla. Admiral, it's yours.
Well, first of all, I think it's quite some time before you will see Chinese submarines in the Arctic region, nuclear submarines, and even longer time before you see them underneath the ice. It takes a lot of technology, it takes a lot of understanding, it takes a lot of training to be able to do it. Well, the Russians are there, the Americans are there, the British are there. So if the Chinese come there, does it make a huge difference from what we have today? Probably not. I think the most interesting part is how Russia will react to China introducing those kinds of offensive capabilities up in the area where they have their strategic ballistic submarines. I think that will be the largest challenge you will find.
Have they?
Yeah, I definitely agree with your last comment. I think Russia won't let them do that before the other powers are involved. But what we will witness is that they will first experiment in their favorite laboratory, Indian Ocean. And that's what they are doing now. We are having the first SSN, Chinese SSN deployments in the Indian Ocean. And to answer your question about bases, they are building base, one in Pakistan. And there are so many facilities in Sri Lanka that it's almost a Chinese-owned base. So they are circling the Indian Ocean to have those support facilities there. And one of the goals is to, I think, support maintenance of submarines, including nuclear.
Camilla, is there a broader issue here of how China will exert influence across the military piece in the region? Do you expect to see a much greater presence of Chinese naval forces, both surface and subsurface, in the region in the future?
Well, of course, it can't be ruled out, and we should be very paying a lot of attention to that. But as the Admiral also mentioned in his opening remarks, we see no evidence of such concrete Chinese military presence and activities in the region as it is now. But of course, the US, in their latest DoD report on the Chinese military power that comes out once in a year, so the one from last year, mentioned this concern about US or Chinese submarines in the Arctic. So we, at least in Denmark, and the Danish Defense Intelligence has been paying growing attention, is paying more and more attention to looking at potential Chinese, or there's also these dual-use facilities. So I think there we need to be very careful. And what we are seeing, and I think it's the same in Norway here, is the question of Chinese research stations, satellite receiver stations, building research networks. So how to put up some clear demands, limits on how to be able to control, have transparency in relation to how these are being used. I think that's the first real challenge there. And then with the long-term challenge, of course, is to follow, and I agree it depends very much on also the developments between China, Russia, but also China and the US, right? Because as it looks now, it's very difficult to envision that the US would at all allow anything close to having a Chinese military presence, like coming into to the Arctic.
Indeed.
At least that's what we are seeing in Greenland, that even small, what seems like very innocent Chinese efforts to build networks there is really being closed down now. And you might know that the US is really increasing both their diplomatic and economic engagement in Greenland just in recent months, reopening their diplomatic office there, having a permanent diplomatic presence in Greenland. They haven't had that since the early 1950s.
Interesting. Admiral.
Just a short story of interest, and China has always had a long perspective on their plans and their strategy.
Yep.
I had the pleasure, it's 10 years ago, but the pleasure to visit China and spend a week with the Chinese chief of the Navy, Wu Shengli. And he gave me all the briefs about the 4 rings and everything. A bit of different emphasis than you had here. And he talked about the protection of sea lines of communications, very concerned about the Malacca Straits, very concerned about the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, and the need for China to protect their interests. He talked about the alternative being the Northeast Passage, but he never talked about protecting anything in the Arctic.
Interesting. So there was a clear limit in his mind as to what would call the extent of Chinese strategic reach as far as the Arctic was concerned.
Well, whether it was a clear distinct that it was not necessary or they didn't have any plan remains to be seen. But the fact is that he didn't bring it up while he brought it up in the other areas.
Interesting. Let me switch to the Republic of Korea. And let me put that question in a broader context, if I may, which is, I envisage the West these days, the global West, as more of an idea than a place. It's a group of democracies, of free markets the world over, centered on its alliances with the United States. Japan, South Korea, Australia, Europe. Not the same, but there are certain linkages with history, with pre-World War I blocs and alliances. If there was to be a major war in Asia-Pacific involving, say, the Republic of Korea with China in the future, and the United States was involved, the focus of this session is on the implications for NATO. What would be the implications of such a conflict for NATO and NATO Europeans specifically? Ben, could you start with that?
Well, I served in South Korea for a year when I was a younger officer, and the ROK Army, the ROK military is exceptional. I mean, these are super fit, well-trained, well-disciplined, and well-equipped armed forces. We've got a strong ally, and as I said, we need allies now more than ever. So having a dependable ROK military that can protect South Korea. The Japanese Defense Force is modernizing, particularly the Navy. They've got real capability. So these are 2 important allies. But of course, it's the access. The Navy bases, Air Force bases, they're probably somewhere close to 40,000 U.S. Army that are in Japan and South Korea, mainly logistics and air and missile defense. So this is part of the capability required to contain China, not to defeat, but to contain and of course, to deter them. So this is an important part of the alliance, just like Norway. They're important allies for us, just the way Norway is an important ally for the United States.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Well, I would just add, don't forget about this little country.
DPRK.
North Korea.
Yeah.
And so from the, I think it's really, just like it's important for NATO not to take your eye off Russia, I think it's really important for our allies in the Far East to closely monitor North Korea. And so, heaven forbid, if this worst case scenario, if there still was a North Korea, which I think is a pretty good bet, then what would Kim Jong-un do? But significantly, I think the Chinese would be just almost pretty much as worried as we would be, and he might. But who does Kim Jong-un listen to? I don't. Does he listen to Beijing? Not if you talk to the Chinese. No, he doesn't. So that's another wild card.
Let me be provocative here. If an Article 5 contingency involves the major ally like the United States, an attack on the United States, would an attack on US forces in the Pacific constitute an Article 5 contingency for the alliance?
Good question.
The NATO oracle has spoken. The answer is no.
I think the Washington Treaty spells out the territorial Hawaii as a state, but when you're talking about something else, I don't know. And of course, there is nothing automatic about Article 5. Ultimately, it's always a political decision.
Yeah, just a reminder about Article 5 and the area where NATO operating. First, Article 5 doesn't oblige the member states to react. They're obliged to consider they are being attacked as well. Their answer is still belonging to them. So the automaticity of, imagining 29 and tomorrow 30 nations will go at war unanimously, well, it's not playing that way. And also the area of responsibility of NATO is limited and doesn't include North America.
Although
NATO is about
it did on September the
It did,
Yeah.
and that's a paradox.
yeah
But it
Or a precedent.
doesn't, or precedent. But
Yeah.
it's all about defending Europe.
yeah. When we wrap up at the end, I want you to all to give me a sense of Stoltenberg's challenge about China, the implications of China's rise for NATO itself. But I'll now move to the next three questions. Sir, over there, you've been very patient.
Yes, hello. I'm Nicholas Steen. I'm the program manager of the Norwegian Nobel Institute, and this is my area. So, what I was hearing you say is a lot about the direct consequences for NATO, the potential challenge in the Arctic, etc., which seems to be far into the future. If there was a war, that would obviously be quite extreme, the challenge. But could you say a bit more about the challenge that arises from the strain that the United States is currently under in trying to deal with China in East Asia? For those of us who read the RAND Corporation's reports on this issue, who read the Department of Defense's reports on these issues, it is quite interesting to see just how challenging the United States is already finding it dealing with China. And is it not a danger that NATO, the European members of NATO are underestimating just what kind of commitment that they will have to make in the future, and rather more immediately than sort of an Arctic challenge or anything like that?
Good question. Anybody else? Sir.
Thank you. My name is Wilhelm Donker. I'm the ambassador of Austria to Norway, but I have a question related to sea power, so far away from a landlocked country. I think building a lot of warships is not the same as sea power. It's the concept of sea power in the sense of Alfred Thayer Mahan, and in the sense the US Navy and America really holds this concept of sea power alive for decades. Admiral, you spoke completely rightly that the Chinese think in long-term perspective in strategies. So my question is on a key strategic issue that I cannot answer, and I think is really the key issue on what we're discussing here. Do you think that the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party understood the concept of sea power, really in the sense of Alfred Thayer Mahan? And do you think that they are willing to challenge the United States in this question? Is this really a part of the Chinese thinking? Thank you.
And a third question. From one of the younger members of the audience would be nice. Come on, be brave. Madam.
I don't know if I qualify for
Certainly
young, but
do.
I'm sorry.
Certainly do.
My name is Anne Jurisch. I'm from Germany and I work in Switzerland in a financial asset management company. And my question is more a general one. At the moment, as internal pressure in China is rising, Hong Kong and so on, and especially now with dealing with the coronavirus, does the Chinese government have the need or an incentive to mobilize nationalism and become aggressive to overcome and to overplay the current situation and mismanagement of the health crisis they are currently facing? Thank you.
That's a great question. In my days in Hong Kong, one really got a sense of the power of nationalism in China and how quickly the Communist Party could go from being a Communist Party to a nationalist party in that event. We'll come back to that question. Let me start with strain on the US. Ben, and implications of China's rise and the danger that NATO Europeans are not really rising or understanding the implications of their own responsibilities.
Well, actually, of course, the strain is there, which is why I emphasize the importance of allies and burden sharing. And this is where I think actually German leadership is going to be the key for all of us. Germany is the only country that can change Chinese behavior and Russian behavior, not the United States. And the reason I say that is because Germany has earned over the last 7 decades a sort of a moral authority. They have obviously economic power, and they're probably the only country that could bring to bear the full weight of a unified European Union, and also bring along the rest of the countries in the alliance. When Germany, or at the NATO summit in Warsaw, when the alliance said we have to transition from assurance to deterrence, that means you have to go from a company of paratroopers in a country to actual capability. And Germany said, we will lead an enhanced forward presence battle group to Lithuania. They were the first country to step up and do it. You could basically hear everybody go, oh shit, the Germans are doing it, now we have to do it. And so that's the kind of leadership that Germany has shown and the potential that's there. So to this dime construct of diplomatic information and economic competition as well as military, Germany is the key here. So that's where I hope some of this strain off on the United States can be relieved if we, the United States, protect this relationship with our very important ally, Germany.
Let me push you on that a bit. If the Europeans, if Germans do not respond, and there's a good chance that they won't given their domestic politics, do you sense that the United States will be forced into deployments of forces it would prefer not to undertake simply to offset European weakness?
Well, in a way, we're having to do that right now.
Yeah. So there is already an implication of that for the choices the US would make in dealing with China. Ergo, you cannot separate the choices NATO Europeans make from the impact on America.
Well, I think the United States, now I live in Frankfurt, so I don't claim to be a European expert, although I do know that Great Britain is part of Europe, even though you guys don't believe it.
Semi-detached, I think, is the appropriate term.
The United States, I would say the average American doesn't really appreciate and understand what Europe is or how Germany's government is, frankly, a fragile coalition government. And
Yeah.
even though AKK and Chancellor Merkel both have said we will be 2%, we have to take on more responsibility. And I think AKK deserves a lot of credit for some courage. With this coalition government, it's not going to happen. So the United States needs to take a different approach to, this is about protecting European citizens. I think most German politicians, and I could be challenged here, would think, okay, Germany doesn't want to lead, but if we think through a European lens, then we talk about protecting European citizens. Germany and the Netherlands should be providing Patriot missile defense for all the critical infrastructure, for example. Germany should be paying for cyber protection for all the critical transportation infrastructure and provide another capability to protect European interests. And I think that's a more sophisticated approach that we should be trying.
BRI, divide and rule. Camilla, any comment on that issue as a Dane? Let me move to this question of sea power. To expand on the question, if I may, it's not just Mahan, it's Corbett. It's sea control versus sea presence. And the Chinese, believe me, do understand the relationship between sea control and sea presence and are building a navy of mass to exert both. Carrier strike groups in the future and a large frigate navy to generate a presence, something that we Europeans are grappling with because the unit cost of ships are so expensive, the Royal Navy for one. Hervé, do you think the Chinese get this?
Well, I do think they get it, and which is interesting is that they have a different approach than Russia on that. I've always been puzzled by the fact that Russia has never been really interested in developing carrier strike groups, for instance. They have a different approach, and that allows me to develop a third model of sea power, which is the current one. It's not anymore Mahan or Corbett or Aube. It's the gray zone that the oceans are allowing to play in, and that gray zone is in peacetime being below the threshold of war, but above the threshold of action. And that's what Russia is very good at by developing some niche where they are really challenging us with their missiles, with what they are doing on the bottom of the oceans and so on. And I think despite the visibility of a massive development of conventional ships, I think China get it as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the sea power battle of tomorrow will take place.
Admiral?
Well, again, from my visit in China, I was astonished by the Chinese cadets and the young officers, their knowledge of Mahan, of Kobe, and a number of other issues. I was also thrilled with the way they connected commercial trade to the military forces. And it all starts with commercial trade. They very well understand that China's prosperity is built on an international commercial trade. They want to control this trade, which means they have to have the fleet, they have to control in the ports, they have to be able to protect the sea routes, and it's a combination of a merchant, a logistic, and a military task to achieve it. And I think that is what we've been seeing for the last 10 years. That's what we are witnessing in the Indian Ocean. That is what we are witnessing in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Djibouti, and elsewhere. They are establishing their ability to control the international trade. And they understand covert. They are using maritime forces that in a peacetime and low tension can be used to control the disputed areas to their advantage. They are building a military force to be able to fight against near-peer competitors. And they are building a force, making it possible for them to take control over distant regions if they have to. But I think, Alan, I want to underline from what I said in the opening, that we should look at what they are doing with the force predominantly from the South China Sea perspective and Taiwan. But it is a force that is capable to be used for something else, but not necessarily planned for it at the moment.
By the way, you've just described Lord Palmerston's imperial policy of 1842.
Yeah, something
exactly like that. Some things never change. Let me have a third question about nationalist internal tensions within China itself. And I'll ask Camilla and Andrew to handle that before we go into the wrap-up. Camilla.
Yeah, well, there's always that risk, of course, that you hint at, that if they feel under growing domestic pressure, they will turn more to nationalism, and the way that they've kind of built up the Communist Party's legitimacy domestically on being the party that brings back China to its rightful place as a great power to get influence and respect. As a great power, in order to get there, the population has to stand behind the Communist Party, right? So of course there's always that risk, but I think we also have to acknowledge, as the Chinese leadership seem to have acknowledged, that nationalism is a two-edged sword, right? That they're also opening up for legitimate room for protests in Chinese society, and we've seen at a lot of the nationalist anti-Japanese protests, for example, that there are often groups or people in those protests who then carry signs where it says, against corruption, or against, we want safe food or medicine or whatever. So it's often domestic issues that comes into these nationalists. So by pushing for more nationalism, they also open more legitimate room for protest within Chinese society. So it's difficult to control, or as the Chinese sometimes say, to guide in a rational direction, right? So it's a two-edged sword, so it's not unproblematic just to use nationalism, and I think they're very aware of that. So it won't be like a easy road to take.
Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with everything Camilla said, and I think we should be concerned about this, but at the same time, not assume that China under Xi Jinping would do something, necessarily do something assertive that's destructive, so for example, it could be something positive in the sense that the PLA may engage in a humanitarian, use one of those carriers to engage in a humanitarian relief operation, and that could be showing the Chinese flag and reflect well on Xi and the PLA. So there are positive and negative ways that China can flex those muscles in response, nationalism.
Right, we have 5 minutes left. I want to give you all a minute each to respond to the question, what was your message to Secretary General Stoltenberg, Ray, NATO's posture on China? Camilla.
Well, I think looking at the Arctic context, which is what I've been doing today, I think, of course, it's part of NATO's area of operation, as you indicated, but I think we should also be very careful. Again, there is no Chinese military presence there. Russia is the primary, and as you also hinted at, the Russian military in the Arctic is often in order to get out of the Arctic, right? So we have a very special situation in the Arctic that we should preserve. And I think we should be careful to have increased the role of NATO in the Arctic, because it could lead to a very a situation that's very difficult to control, and where it's very difficult to preserve the Arctic Council and the different Arctic governance institutions. So at least in Denmark, and I think here in Norway as well, we have this discussion about how much NATO in the Arctic and where in the Arctic. So at least they should be very careful about how far north and how far east a NATO presence in the Arctic should be. So should
Thank you.
Going.
Well, that would be around maritime military mobility and consequences. Today, it's easier for migrant or refugee to travel across Europe than for military with its equipment.
Yeah.
So we need to fix that, and by fixing that, we need really to address the policy on critical infrastructure. And we have 29 different answers today, but that's where China is going at play on an invisible ground. So we absolutely need to address that question.
Thank you. Ben?
So 3 things. First of all, he's got to continue the work he's doing to maintain the cohesion of the alliance. I think that was actually on display in London. If you subtract 2 little silly things, actually the London leaders meeting was a very, very productive thing, but media will typically focus on that kind of silliness. So all credit to the Secretary General. That's got to continue. Secondly, continue the drumbeat on readiness. And everybody knows the best way to prevent a conflict is to be ready for a conflict. And so the emphasis on readiness, modernization efforts, and things like military mobility as an underpinning part of readiness, I think, deserves his attention and our support. The third one, though, may surprise you. It's about we need a strategy for the Black Sea, where we are competing with Russia and we're competing with China.
Yeah.
Competing with Russia in terms of military capabilities and on information in the information space, and holding them accountable for complying with international law, but also investing in infrastructure there so that the Chinese don't come in and feel the need and then and cause us to be reliant. We have a vulnerability where we're relying, exactly as Hervé said, on infrastructure that's controlled by or owned by somebody else. And we need a strategy then where Turkey sits in the middle of the map, not at the bottom of the map.
Andrew.
I guess I would say that we stereotypically, and we've said it, and but it's true that China is good at long-term planning, long-term strategy. But the flip side of that is they're not very good at short-term planning and handling surprises, unexpected events, crises, whether it's the coronavirus or other things. So we should anticipate surprises with China, and not that they're intentionally planning. So yes, NATO should plan long-term, and China's a long-term challenge, but don't ignore short-term potential for short-term surprises.
Thank you. And Admiral.
Well, to some extent, I'll take forward the same points as Ben has done, but I would like to twist it a little bit. I think it's very important that NATO maintains its solidarity and stick together as the 29 coming now up to 30 nations. I think it's also important that NATO supports the United States in other areas than the territory which is covered by the NATO treaty. But when it comes to China, I would say that we should be working more at a dialogue, starting with a dialogue. Our aim is to prevent that anything happens between China and US or China or Europe. if we start off with the attitude that China is the big challenge and the big problem and we need to be afraid of them,
Yeah.
or we need to be prepared for fighting a war with them, that's probably what will happen in the end. But if we start the dialogue with creating the understanding that China can never succeed with its economy or its expansion without having partners and allies around the world, Europe will be one of the most important partners and allies for them to succeed. So a dialogue to prevent any kind of escalation, to prevent any kind of misstanding, to avoid that we look at each other as enemies, I think is one of the areas which will be most important to start off with.
Sir, thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Kate.
What a morning. What a panel. Give them a big hand. I have some gifts directly from Brussels for the Admiral.
I'm not allowed to have anything from Brussels.
So
We're outside the EU as
Exactly.
well, you know.
We're all Norwegians now.
some hand-knitted mittens for the gentleman, for Camilla, Norwegian, and for your wife, Julian, because you
All
have
right.
been here many times.
I
so
have.
You have
And
for
I have
your
so
own.
many mittens.
For Corinne. What a panel once again. I
Thank you
think
very
they
much.
are.
Thank you all. Great. Thank you very much. Great.
We just have 15 minutes for coffee break, and then we will challenge our politicians.